Hello and welcome to Tank and AFV News. I'm Tom, and this is the 8th episode in a series we are doing called The Tanks of World War II. Now, each episode we look at a different tank from the Second World War, starting in 1939 and working our way to the war's end in 1945. Now, currently, we're looking at the German invasion of France in 1940 and the tanks used by the French, British, and German forces during that campaign. So far, we have examined a number of French tanks, starting with the World War I veteran Renault FT, moving to the Char D, the FCM 36, the Renault 35 and 40, and the Hotchkiss 35 and 39. Now, in this episode, we examine what may be the best of the French tanks in 1940, the S-35, known also as the Somua. Following World War I, acquisition and deployment of armored vehicles in the French military was split between two different branches of service, the infantry and the cavalry. Now, the infantry branch had a requirement for a light two-man tank in the spirit of the old Renault FT, and as we saw in previous episodes, this role was filled by the Renault 35, the Hotchkiss 35, and the FCM 36. Now, the infantry also wanted a battle tank, that is something roughly analogous to what other countries would call a heavy tank, and this role was filled by the Char B1 bis, which we will examine in the next episode. So that left a hole in the French tank inventory as far as the infantry side of things, in terms of a vehicle that would fulfill the role most countries would consider a medium tank, notwithstanding some of the older Char D tanks still in service. Fortunately for the French, the cavalry branch came up with a requirement for something that would be roughly analogous to a medium tank. Now, the cavalry had three different vehicle requirements based on three different missions. And since these are very French, long French words, I'm not going to try to pronounce them. I'll just use the acronyms, which is the AMR, the AMD, and the AMC. Now, the A stands for a French word that roughly translates to car, although it should be pointed out that in this instance it can refer to either a wheeled or a tracked vehicle. And the use of the term car for cavalry vehicles was a bit of a semantic trick, based on the fact that technically tanks were the province of the infantry. Now, oddly enough, we'll see that same phenomenon occur when we get into U.S. tank development later on in the series, where we'll run into U.S. cavalry combat cars, which were almost identical to the light tanks, but we digress. The AMD was intended for the traditional cavalry role of long-range exploration and road patrol, and this job would eventually fall to the Panhard four-wheeled armored cars. The role of the AMR, close-range battlefield reconnaissance, would be filled by the AMR-33 and AMR-35, light tanks armed only with machine guns, and we're not going to do full episodes on those, I just don't have enough information on them. The primary fighting vehicle of the cavalry would be the AMC. Now, at a certain point, the French cavalry got stuck with the Hotchkiss 35, and while this was designed as an infantry tank, this vehicle was purchased for the cavalry role, despite the objections of some of the French cavalry higher-ups at the time. One of the earlier vehicles proposed for the AMC role was a half-tracked vehicle designed by Somua, which was a subsidiary of the Schneider Corporation. Somua stands for, and you'll have to pardon my French, I will try pronouncing this one, Société d'Hôtelage Mécanique et d'Usinage d'Artillerie. So French speakers can make fun of me for that one. The cavalry rejected this vehicle since it did not offer the mobility of some of the fully tracked AMC alternatives offered by Renault. However, the Renault vehicle did not satisfy all the cavalry requirements either, and there were concerns that Renault was already becoming overstretched by trying to meet their existing quotas of infantry tanks. Therefore, the cavalry branch felt that Somua still had an important part to play in French vehicle production and encouraged them to submit a tank design in 1934. Now, if the name Schneider rings bells with anyone, that's because they, of course, designed the French Schneider World War I era tank. In fact, this particular vehicle was designed by an engineer named Eugene Brillet? I'm going to go with Brillet. He would also play a role in the development of the new Somua tank, designing the suspension for this new vehicle. Now, curiously enough, Brillet had also done suspension design work for the Czech firm of Skoda for their LT-VZ35 tank, which would later become known as the Panzer 35 once it was sort of absorbed into the German Wehrmacht. Now, we will look at the suspension in more detail in the technical part of the video, although it's safe to say that the Panzer 35 and the Somua S-35 suspensions are really quite similar, and both frankly derived from the old Vickers 6-ton. In 1935, a prototype was delivered called the AC-3. Now, as per normal French practice at the time, Somua only designed the hull. The turret was designed by the French government APX workshop. Tests continued through 1936 and 37 with a couple different pilot vehicles, and several flaws were noted and corrected, including a better engine, wider tracks, and improved hull ventilation. In March of 1936, a contract was awarded for 50 vehicles in what came to be called the AC-4 version. Now, delivery started in mid-1937 with the vehicle being officially designated Char de Cavalerie 1935 S, or S-35 as it's more commonly known. Now, these early prototypes are fitted with the APX-1 turret, which was the same turret as fit on the Char D2 tank. However, the actual production run of S-35 tanks would feature the APX-1 CE turret, which featured a larger turret ring. The hull of the vehicle comprised of 4 separate large castings, and those posed a serious challenge for French industry, resulting in a series of delays in production. The French cavalry would end up ordering 600 S-35 tanks in total, although these were not all in service by the time war broke out in Europe. By the time of the German invasion in the summer of 1940, the number was up to 417 that had been delivered, although not all were in service yet. Had the French surrender not put an abrupt halt to tank production, the S-35 was slated to be replaced by an improved version called the S-40, which featured increased use of welding rather than castings, as well as other improvements. At 19 tons, the S-35 was the closest thing the French had to a medium tank in 1940, despite the fact that it was technically a cavalry car, as we explained previously. And it's pretty fair to say it offered the best balance of firepower, armor, and mobility of any French tank of that period, although it's certainly not a perfect design by any stretch. It's a rather easily recognizable vehicle, being rather tall and narrow, with a very rounded appearance due to the cast hull. The turret looks very similar to the one on the Char B1 bis, although it's actually a little different. Compared to its German opponents, it's no wider than a Panzer II, and only a couple of feet longer, yet it's twice the weight and 2 feet taller. So narrow, tall, and fairly heavy for its size would probably be the quickest way to describe the vehicle. The Somua has a crew of 3 consisting of the driver, radio operator, and commander. Like with most French tanks of the period, the commander has to also serve as the gunner and loader for the turret weapons. However, the radio operator is able to somewhat assist with the loading since the turret on the S-35 is the APX-1 CE, CE standing for the French words for enlarged turret ring. Sometimes you'll see this turret referred to in sources as a 1.5 person turret. It's a good thing that the radio operator is able to help with the loading, since not all the S-35 tanks actually received radios by the time fighting broke out in 1940. So at least he can help with the loading, because if he has no radio, then there's nothing else for him to do in the vehicle. Like other French tanks, visibility for the commander was limited, and the vision devices on the vehicle were fairly crude. The commander had a vision cupola on the top of the tank, but did not have a hatch on the top, so he always had to fight buttoned up. There is a hatch on the back of the turret that opens up, but it was not something that could be used by a commander during combat for making observations, unless he wanted to expose most of his body to enemy fire. The turret ergonomics are generally regarded as quite poor. The commander has changed positions to go from the gunner's sight to the commander's vision cupola, a less than ideal situation for quick target acquisition. For an actual hands-on demonstration of this issue, I would recommend watching the Chieftains Inside the Hatch video on the S-35, which we'll include a link to in the description of this video. The cast hull is one of the most distinctive aspects of the design and presented some issues. The hull was cast in 4 pieces, 2 for the lower hull, 2 for the upper. Aside from the difficulties in producing the pieces, one of the main challenges of this design was the fact that the rear upper piece had to be unbolted and removed in order to replace the engine, a rather time-consuming process. Being cast, it's hard to give exact figures for armor thickness, but it ranges from 47 millimeters on the hull front and 40 millimeters on the hull and turret sides. Turret front being about 42 millimeter. The armor has some slope to it as well, particularly on the lower front hull. Now, this level of armor protection was significantly better than what its German adversaries could brag of at the time, and more importantly, its armor was thick enough to resist most German tank and anti-tank guns of the period. French cast armor of the 1930s was known for having some quality issues, although I haven't seen any particular evidence that it's affected the S-35. Usually those issues seem to have affected the 2-man infantry tanks. One interesting item regarding crew protection was an automatic fire suppression system. Now, this system was made by the firm Telecamet and utilized pressurized tanks of methyl bromide. Now, I don't know exactly what methylbromide does, because I'm no expert on fire suppression systems, but that's a pretty advanced feature for 1940. The driver sits, as one would expect, in the front section of the hull on the left-hand side. His controls include an actual steering wheel rather than the more conventional steering tillers found in tanks of the period. The transmission features 5 forward speeds in reverse, as well as a rather sophisticated design for the time period. The radio operator sits to the driver's right, although he moves back toward the turret when he assists with loading, being careful to duck when the gun is fired to avoid getting hit from the ejected brass cartridge. When the S-35 entered service, they did not always have their full complement of driver's hatches and visions devices, so it's not uncommon to see pictures of tanks on parade missing these items. The engine is a 190 horsepower V8 petrol fuel engine with a displacement of 773 cubic inches. Frankly, there's not much detail out there regarding this engine in the English language sources I have access to, so I can't tell you much else about it. Sources say the engine maintenance was made difficult by the generally poor access provided by the rear hull design. One interesting feature was that there were 2 fuel tanks, a smaller 100-liter tank on one side of the engine and a larger tank of 410 liters on the other side. The larger tank would automatically replenish the smaller tank as the fuel was consumed. It was reported that hurriedly trained tank crews in 1940 were not always aware of the 2 separate tanks and mistakenly only filled the smaller tank, leading to a very limited operating range, as you might imagine. If both tanks were filled, typical operating range was 140 miles on road, top speed was about 25 miles an hour, and off-road speed listed at 20 miles an hour. The suspension was a rather conventional design, rather similar to the leaf spring system on the Skoda LTVZ35, which is not surprising since they shared the same designer, as we noted earlier in the video. Now, it's fair to say that he took his inspiration from the suspension on the Vickers 6-ton tank. As we discussed in our earlier episode on the Polish 7TP, the Vickers 6-ton suspension was one of the most influential designs of the 1930s, influencing Russian, Polish, and Italian tank design as well as others. Now, the suspension on the S-35 was noted for being rather difficult to repair due to the armored skirts that cover it. Also, it was noted that the tank had rather poor obstacle climbing ability due to how low the front idler sat near the ground. In regards to firepower, the S-35 boasted a 47mm SA-35 cannon mounted next to a 7.5mm machine gun. Now, this was a L-32 caliber gun, meaning the ratio of barrel diameter to barrel length was 32:1, which was shorter than the French 47mm anti-tank gun of the same period. And in fact, that French 47mm anti-tank gun is a completely different weapon with much better penetration stats than the tank-mounted SA-35. Now, still, that said, the SA-35 had better armor penetration than either of the 37mm guns used in other French tanks of the period, or the French 25mm anti-tank gun. Armor penetration stats of the 47mm gun vary depending on the source, but are in the ballpark of 35mm at 500 meters, roughly. And considering that no German tank in the 1940 campaign had armor better than 30mm, that meant they were vulnerable to the S-35 at normal battlefield ranges, while the 20 and 37mm guns on the German tanks were not very effective against the armor of the S-35. Compared to the 37mm guns on the Panzer III and Panzers 35 and 38, the 47mm French gun also fired a somewhat more effective high explosive round for use against soft targets. The machine gun was the standard 7.5mm Rebelle, although the mounting was unusual, and that allowed for a small amount of traverse independent of the main gun. Turret traverse was accompanied by an electric motor, although final gun laying on the target was done with the manual handwheel. The S-35 was intended to have a radio as standard equipment, but shortages meant that not all tanks did. The standard radio was the ER-29, while the command version was the ER-26. Only about 100 radios were provided to each French DLM, meaning that not all tanks got one, although, at minimum, at least each platoon got a radio. The ER-29 had a rather poor reputation among S-35 crews, and it's said that transmissions could be blocked by trees or other objects. Crews went so far as to remove paint from the radio antenna in an attempt to improve reception. Due to its relatively short service life in the French Army, there are no major upgrades or variants of the S-35 that saw widespread service. As we noted earlier, there were plans for an S-40, which featured more welding in the hull and turret design as well as improvements to the suspension and engine. This vehicle never got beyond prototype stage. There was an attempt to make an assault gun based on the S-35 called the SAU-40. Now, this consisted of an S-35 chassis that was enlarged and a 75mm gun mounted in the hull, and the turret armed only with a machine gun. Only one prototype had been built before the invasion of France, although it is said that this single vehicle did actually see combat in 1940. After the fall of France in 1940, the German army took possession of the French tank fleet and pressed a considerable number of S-35 tanks into service. While many former French tanks in German service were modified to serve as flamethrower tanks or self-propelled artillery, the S-35 was primarily used as a gun tank by the Wehrmacht. Most of the Somua tanks put into German service were altered by having the top cupola cut off and replaced with one with a hatch so the commander could look out of the top of the vehicle. Now, this is a common alteration visible in many S-35 tanks on display in museums. As a cavalry tank, the S-35 was reserved for the light mechanized divisions known as DLMs, or Division Légère Mécanique. Again, pardon my French. Despite being called a light mechanized division, the DLM was actually rather heavily equipped, being the closest thing the French had to a proper armored division at the time. The French had 3 of these units equipped with Somua tanks, and they were named, as you might expect, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd DLM. Each DLM had 2 tank regiments made up of 2 squadrons of S-35 and 2 squadrons of the smaller Hotchkiss tank. Each squadron was made up of 45 tanks with 4 troops of 5 tanks each. Now, these DLMs were very powerful armored units and roughly comparable to a German panzer division, although with less infantry support. These were probably the best of the French armored divisions, and their existence defies the common misperception that the French squandered all of their armor in quote-unquote penny packets spread throughout the army. In reality, the best French tank, the S-35, were organized inside a powerful armored unit of division size. All 3 of the DLMs were earmarked as part of the French force that was to move quickly into the Low Countries to meet what they thought would be the main German line of attack. Of course, the main thrust was further south through the Ardennes, and the 3 DLMs would be part of the Allied force that was cut off by the German offense and forced to retreat back to Dunkirk. Now, the German 3rd, 4th, and 9th Panzer Divisions were part of the German force that attacked into Belgium, drawing forward the Allied units and the DLMs, and the S-35 saw combat against German tanks in several instances in that campaign. Now, in his book Panzer III vs. Somua S-35, author Steve Zaloga details some of the tank versus tank combat that occurred in Belgium in 1940, and we would highly recommend picking that title up and reading it if you're interested in learning more details. We don't really have the time to go into it in depth in a video of this sort. Now, he notes that the battle at Hunut-Medorp, again, hopefully I said that right, in Belgium on the 12th and 13th of May 1940 was one of the very first large-scale tank-on-tank battles in history. While tanks had certainly been used in combat previous to this battle, never had they been employed in large numbers on both sides in a direct confrontation. Now, in that fight, the S-35 proved an effective vehicle, although the deficiencies in the turret design hampered its ability to act in a coordinated manner. Tank losses were heavy on both sides, although German tank losses were somewhat less and were mitigated by the fact that they were able to recover their knocked-out tanks, while the French were forced to abandon theirs, seeing as they lost the battlefield. The S-35 fought on until the end of the 1940 campaign, although its combat history did not end there. In 1941, the Vichy French government got permission from the German occupation government to send a squadron of S-35 tanks to North Africa to defend their holdings there. Eventually, these vehicles would switch sides and become part of the Free French Armored Force that saw action against the Axis in Tunisia in 1943. On May 11 of 1943, these Somua tanks saw action helping crush the remnant of the 21st Panzer Division 2 days before the final German surrender in Tunisia. Following the Tunisian campaign, these Free French tankers switched to M4 Sherman tanks provided by the United States, although they kept the Somua nameplates from the front hull of the S-35s, adding them to their Sherman tanks as a point of pride. The Somua also saw service with Axis forces, including Germany, Italy, Bulgaria, and Hungary, although in a very limited numbers in those last 3 countries. In German service, the Somua was designated as the Panzerkampfwagen 35S, parentheses F, the F indicating the country of origin for this particular Beutepanzer, as that was the term for foreign tanks in German service. In German service, the S-35 was modified with German radios and a new turret top hatch and used as a tank in second-line panzer units. While it was not considered appropriate for use in front-line German panzer divisions, the usefulness of the vehicle was recognized by the Germans and used to fill gaps in their own tank inventory. Typically, these units were used in occupation and anti-partisan duty, although they certainly saw frontline combat use as the war situation grew more grim for Germany. One of the more unusual uses of the S-35 in German service was as parts of armored trains on the Eastern Front. German S-35 crews saw combat on the Eastern Front, Finland, and the Balkans, and in Western Europe, generally being outclassed by newer models of Allied tanks at that point in the war. So how do we rate the Somua S-35 as a tank? It's certainly one of the best, if not the best tank that France had in 1940. It had decent mobility and good armor and good firepower. In fact, better than its German opponents at that point in the war. That said, the S-35 was also a rather odd design with a number of deficiencies. As we noted in the technical discussion, it suffered from having poor crew ergonomics, in particular a very overworked tank commander who has to serve as both commander and gunner. He has no ability to stick his head out of the top of the tank and observe the battlefield directly with his own eyes due to the poor design of the French cupolas. Armor protection levels, as we said, were good, although the layout of the suspension skirts and rear armor made repairs to the engine and suspension time-consuming and difficult. The placement of the front idler rather low to the ground negatively impacted the ability to navigate obstacles, and the high center of gravity combined with the rather narrow design of the vehicle made it more prone to tip over compared to other designs. So while we can say in some ways that the S-35 was superior to the Germans' Panzer III and IV in 1940, I would say overall that the Panzer III and IV were much better designs in the big picture. And the reason I say so is because in 1940 the S-35 was as good a tank as it was ever going to be. There is no significant upgrade potential in the Somua design. The narrow hull and the small turret ring preclude any possibility of a bigger turret and better gun in the future without really substantial changes to the vehicle. Given the nature of the tank's powertrain and suspension, it's also hard to see how the vehicle could be up-armored much more than it was. This is not true of the German designs. Within 2 years, the Panzer III and IV would both significantly increased frontal protection and firepower. They would also form the basis of a variety of different tank destroyers, self-propelled artillery and assault guns, and other weapon systems. In fact, the upgunned Panzer IV and the Panzer III-based Stug 3 assault gun would form the backbone of German armored forces throughout almost the entire war. So in that regard, the Somua was a bit of a dead end in regards to tank design, albeit, I think, a rather interesting one. If you are interested in seeing an S-35 Somua, several still exist. Unfortunately, you'll have to go to Europe probably to see one. There are examples at the British Tank Museum at Bovington, the French Museum at Saumur, and the Russian collection that previously was at Kubinka but has now been moved to Patriot Park, I believe. Now, the U.S. possesses an S-35, which used to reside at Aberdeen Proving Grounds in Maryland, but has since been moved to Fort Lee in Virginia and is no longer on public display as far as I know. Alright, well that pretty much wraps up this episode. Before we go, I wanted to review some of the sources that we used to write this episode in case people want to read further for themselves. We'll provide a link in the description that will go to the Tank and AFV News website that will have then links to these different books there. First off, there's New Vanguard French Tanks of World War II, Volume 2 by Stephen Zaloga. Also by Stephen Zaloga and also from Osprey Books is Osprey Duel, Panzer III versus Somua S-35. AFV Weapons Profile number 36, which covers a variety of French tanks by James Bingham. The Encyclopedia of French Tanks and Armored Vehicles 1914 through 1940 by Francois Vauvilliers. And last but not least, Track Story S-35 Somua by Pascal Danjou. I want to thank you all for watching. Let me know what you think. I know it's been a long time since I posted one of these, and obviously the format's a bit different this time. I sort of had to change things up just because I don't have access to the green screen I used in previous episodes, but I thought it would be an opportunity to try something different. So let me know if people like this better than the old style, which was sort of me standing there talking a bit. Anyway, thank you much, and thank you for watching. Subscribe if you enjoyed this. If you really like it and want to see more of these, we do have a Patreon page if you want to support us financially, because you know what? Books cost money. Anyhow, we will catch you on the next one, which will be Char B1 Bis. Hopefully I'll have that one done. I'm aiming for weekly, since I'm able to devote most of my time to these now. Alright, thank you much.